Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to be back on the Hercules Hobbies trailer. It's been a couple of weeks since the last video, so before we lose our place, let's get on with the build. As a recap, the last thing we did was step 9, building the sprung retracts and the kingpin plate. Note the kingpin is currently on the wrong side. The 4 corner holes are countersunk, which should be on the same side as the pin, but that's going to magically fix itself later in the build. Here we go then, step 10. Fitting the legs and kingpin to the chassis. For the nuts and bolts we need everything that's left in the pot. The screw bag was for steps 8, 9 and 10. There's the 12 M3 flange nuts, 8 M3x12s and 4 M3x23 countersunk screws. For plastic there's the 2 mounts for the plate, C5 and C2. Starting with the plate we need to fit the wedge-shaped mount to the very front of the chassis, and the chassis rails will hold it nicely in place for now. A bit further back, the other plastic bit slots into its position. And here we have another instance of building without enough sleep. You can see there's a hole in the middle at one end. That's part of the mechanism that makes the legs pop up. The hole should be at the other end. So yes, I've got the plate backwards. In the 4 corners, we need to fit the long countersunk screws and some flange nuts. When we've got the top structure on these, it's going to be rather inaccessible, so thread lock is a must to make sure they don't drop out. Despite fitting it backwards, the fit was still rather excellent. Everything lines up perfectly. Legs next. Fitting them is very straightforward, but first, those 2 hairs at the top of the screen. I've no idea where they came from. The hair on my head isn't that long, and my beard is a lot curlier. Most odd. They look like they're stuck on the lens hood. Anyway, the legs need 4 of the screws and nuts each. They don't need to be done up incredibly tight, just nipped up. Over tightening will risk splitting the plastic under the screw heads. Some thread lock on these will be a good idea too. The legs feel really solid on the chassis, and the mechanism works a treat. They need very little pressure on the levers to retract. Very nice. Step 11, and it's time to open up another bag. This one covers 11, 12 and 13, and has a couple of rather strong magnets. So before we can filter out the bits for step 11, we need to unstick the metal parts, and put the magnets to one side where they won't get attracted to anything else. Right, we're building up the 2 halves of the toolbox, and part of the retractable leg mechanism. So we'll be needing 2 of what they're calling coupler nuts, 2 M3x8s, 4 3x28mm shafts, 12 3x8mm self-tappers, and 4 2x6mm countersunk self-tappers. We'll get the plastic bits out section by section as they're quite large. For this bit we'll need Q4 and Q3, 2 E5s and 2 Q1s. We'll start with the door, Q3. There's 2 of these to assemble, but they're absolutely identical, so we'll only show one in the video, so we're not repeating ourselves. In the top corners we need to fit one of the little countersunk screws. These don't hold anything together as such, they're there as something for the magnets to grab. We don't need to do them up all the way, we need the tops of the screws to be ever so slightly below the surface of the little bosses, just a tiny fraction of a millimetre. Next the 2 pins can go in. They're a really loose fit, so they'll probably end up dropping out, but having them in makes sure the little cover plates fit nicely. Flip the door over and do a dry fit of the little Q1s. They should fit nice and flat to the surface. If the nubs on the back are too long, then they would need a quick pass with a sanding block. These ones though fit perfectly, so we can go and glue them in right away. I'm using poly cement. It'll take up any small gaps and has a fairly short cure time. Plasti weld would work fine too, but it's probably best to avoid cyanoacrylate, especially the thin stuff. There's a good chance it would find its way to the pin and really bind up the hinge. Now we need a Q4, which has some slots for the hinge pins to sit in. They're a nice tight fit, so once you've got them all fully seated, the assembly will just about hold itself together while we fit the E5s. They sit over the hinge and clamp it all together. To hold them in, we need to use 2 of the self-tappers, 1 on each side. They don't need to be done up all that tight, just make sure the screw head is seated and it will be just fine. With both the E5s fitted, we've got ourselves a working door. It's a little bit stiff, but that's not a bad thing. It's certainly not going to open by accident. Next we've got 2 X5s to join the 2 halves together, and 2 Q2s that appear to partially block some holes. To attach the Q2s we need some of the double-sided tape that the kit came with. It's a paper-based tape rather than everybody's favourite, sticky back plastic. It looks like the roll's been around a while and quite possibly out in the sun. The first few inches of the roll have all but lost their sticky, not unlike regular sellotape that's been exposed to a lot of UV. Peeling off the non-sticky bit, we do get to some that still sticks, so I reckon it will do the job. If you're building one, something from 3M might be a good buy, just in case. With the tape on the tab at the top of the Q2s, we can stick them over the holes in the boxes. It does seem a bit odd, could be a limitation of the moulds. They make some nice big square holes into small holes. The X5s link the two halves of the box together. From the top we need to insert one of the self-tappers and thread it into the X5. We only need to do them up so they're not quite flopping around, so we can square it all up. Install the other one and stand the boxes up so they're side by side so the ends are nice and straight. Then give the self-tappers an extra little twist. One more little step to do in step 11. The widgets that convert the fore and aft motion to an outwards motion to trigger the retract mechanism. There's not much to them. We need two B2s, a C4 and the remaining M3 screws and the coupler nut. These are some bits that again aren't going to be easy to get to later, so we need to apply some thread lock inside the coupler nuts. We could also apply a little bit of grease to the outside, but it shouldn't really be necessary. The movement's already nice and free, and dirty grease after a bit of running might cause more damage in the long run. The nuts go through the bottom of the B2s and line up with the holes in C4. The screws can be done up nice and snug, as the nuts are sized to give that little bit of clearance we need to keep everything moving freely. Step 12, and it looks like we're finishing the box. Okay, plastic first. We need two E4s, the holders for the wheel chocks, two X1s, which make up the floor of the toolbox, and two X5s. Just like the top bit, they're there to link the halves of the floor. And for the screws, there's 4 M3x8s, 2 M3x18s, 14 3x8mm self-tappers, 6 M3 flange nuts, and we need the 4 magnets, which you'll want to keep away from the rest or you'll be forever peeling off the screws. The first thing to do is glue the magnets in so they can dry while we get on with the rest. They've got some neat little mounts on the X1s. It doesn't really matter which way round they go, as they're going to be equally attracted to the steel screws in the doors either way round. To keep them in, we're going to use some Zapper Gap. It's a medium thick cyanoacrylate that's designed to fill gaps, as the name suggests. A couple of drops down each side will do the trick. Just remember it's going to take a little while to fully harden, so they need to be left flat to dry. Next we can install the top half of the box, which means we get a nice wide shot of the chassis. At this stage the box doesn't really have a front as such, so it will happily fit either way around. 4 of the holes should line up with the bosses on 2 of the cross members. It can be a bit tricky to get them in just the right spot, but they do all line up perfectly. For screws, we need to fit 4 of the self-tappers in the inner holes. They only need to be snug. There's no need to do them up super tight, as all you'll do is strip the plastic. While we're here, we can fit the release for the legs. It just sits on the chassis rails lining up with 2 holes. From the bottom we need to insert the long M3 screws, and from the top we need to install 2 of the flange nuts. But first some thread lock, as just like a lot of the other nuts, they're not going to be accessible once we get the top structure on. Now the cyano's dried a bit, we should be able to handle the floor plates without worrying about dropping out the magnets. Each side gets a chop mount fitted. They need a pair of M3x8s and flange nuts each. There's 2 locations on each side they will fit, so if you've got a large electronics pack you could fit both on one side, both on the front, or any combination. These will end up wanting some thread lock, but we're going to go without for now, as these will get removed when we do some painting. To link the 2 halves up, we've got 2 X5s. Just like the box, they go between the 2 halves and get attached with the self-tappers. There's another little bit that ends up going in the middle, but that threads into the posts in the box. Open the doors and position the floor piece over the box. The fit is good, but you do have to jiggle it around a bit to get it to drop in. Around the edges there's 4 screw holes that need self-tappers. Screw them in so they're still just a little bit loose at first until we get the middle strap fitted, which again just needs a couple of self-tappers and the plastic part X4. When it's all straight, go around and snug up all the screws from side to side. And there we go, one complete box. The doors work nicely, the magnets snap them shut with quite a bit of force. For now though, we are going to leave them open so the cyano can dry out without risking gluing the door shut. One more step for today I think. Step 13, the wheels. There's 2 types of wheels. One has a larger hole for some bearings and the rest are for wheel hexes. Before we fit them to the chassis, we need to fit the tyres. There's nothing too unusual about them. The rubber's fairly stiff and they have some very dense foams fitted. All we do is pull the tyre and foam over the wheel and give it a good massage to get the bead seated. I'm thinking because they're not driven wheels and it's going to be used on a fairly smooth surface, we'll probably get away without gluing them. But if they do ever pop off, we can glue them later, of course. All the tyres and wheels go together the same way, so here we have a full set ready to fit. The rearmost axle needs the wheel with the bearings. They need pressing in with the big end of the Tamiya cross wrench or something similar. We want to press the outer race so they sit nice and straight in the wheel. The wheel then just slides over the axle and gets an M4 nylock to hold it on. You need to be a bit careful not to over tighten it though. You can bind up the bearings if you overdo it. The wheels on the front two axles have some drive pins and hexes. The pins slide into the holes in the axle, but they're very loose, so we need to have the holes level so they don't fall out. Then we slide a hex over the top, and follow that with a hex wheel and an M4 nylock. This time the spacing and clearance is just right, so we can bottom out the nut without any binding. Rinse and repeat a few more times, and we've got a rolling chassis. With the legs out, it sits nicely. I'm impressed. There's been very little that didn't fit. Great stuff. Next time, with the trailer, we'll be making a start on the box structure. There's almost as much of that to build as we've already done on the chassis. Should be fun. Next week, with any luck, we'll be at Wings and Wheels over in Essex. Always a good show with a bring and buy full of slightly used and abused bargains. So, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you fancy it, and comment if you got something to say. Bye guys!